All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s, when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at Progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody African. This day, September 30th, 2006, Florida GOP Representative Mark Foley resigned abruptly in a one-sentence letter to the Florida Governor Jeb Bush. This resignation came after Foley had been confronted with a series of sexually explicit internet messages that he was reported to have sent to underage congressional pages. This became known as the Congressional Page Scandal, or if you read some articles, the Mark Foley Scandal. It is never a good sign, listeners, when the name of the scandal is just your name. But here to discuss Foley's behavior, his resignation, the implications, if any. And also, I will note, the last time a GOP congressman from Florida became embroiled in a scandal over underage affairs, it has never happened again.
No record or evidence of that.
No record or evidence of that. Let this be the last time we even glancingly refer to Matt Gaetz on this podcast. I'd be very glad to not do that, but I couldn't help but think of that current scandal. But anyway, here to discuss the Mark Foley scandal, the Congressional Page scandal are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So, this is full of euphemisms, but I think we should go right into just what is it that Foley did. So there's sexually explicit messages and so forth. And, Foley did do a little bit of trying to say, well, these were sort of innocent remarks or whatever. But I don't know. Do one of you want to dive in and just sort of talk us through how these were far from innocent exchanges with basically congressional interns?
Oh, yeah. I mean, first of all, we should say these congressional interns are teenagers. So they are all underage. These are not, college students or graduate students or something of that nature. And the nature of the messages back and forth start out sort of harmless and could be chalked up to just being friendly or overly friendly, but they progressively become more and more disturbing. Some of the messages are just, I keep saying text messages. They're instant messages. Some of the instant messages are, what are you wearing? I'd love to slip that off you. Things that were not appropriate for an adult to be sending to a 16-year-old child. And I think tipped a lot of people off that this is not okay. These exchanges are not okay.
Yeah. Can I actually just sort of go right to that exchange? Because it struck me, So first off, what are you wearing as an instant message from a congressperson to an underage person? That's already crossing a line.
Yeah.
But then you read the reports, one of the pages responds, T-shirt and shorts. Just like the most, milquetoast, banal, just like, I'm just going to give you, I clearly am creeped out. I want to move on. And then Foley responds, I'd love to slip them off of you. So clearly there's just this predatory aggressive thing going on, but I was just struck by that response where it was just like t-shirt and shorts. I want no part of this. Pages were clearly trying to avoid this person and avoid any of these situations, and Foley was pushing the agenda here, clearly.
Or is that also an innocent response too?
Maybe,
sort of like
t-shirt
and shorts. I mean, if you're unaware, and some teenagers are, completely unaware of like the context of what's being said, you're probably not going to say, hey, you know what, that's inappropriate to someone who's older than you or your superior or what have you.
But the way that you're talking about it, I think also reveals how calculated all of this was. First of all, he was messaging more than one page, right? He was doing this over a period of time in which he would start with those messages of plausible deniability when they were 16 and part of the page program, and he would stay in touch with them and then escalate over time. There wasn't evidence that he had sexual contact with any of them before age 18, but what you're describing is a very clear process of grooming, and because of the technological age we're talking about, this starts happening somewhere in the late 1990s, early 2000s, there's a paper trail. Yeah. All of his messages are there and eventually surfaced and given to ABC News.
Yeah, I mean, not to at all even hint at sort of excusing or diminishing this behavior, but I think it is important context to realize that there is an element of like old man doesn't understand how the internet works at play, right? And sending these messages and not realize like, oh, there's a trail here for sure. And 2006, it's an interesting moment. We've done some other stories about this, about sort of politicians not realizing this whole internet thing and the consequences of it and the way it can spiral.
Yeah, and it doesn't mitigate anything to say that, but it does explain how he got caught, because he just, didn't realize there were copies made of all of those messages.
Or that they would share this with someone else as well. I think even in the grooming process, there's this intimidation that they won't tell or they won't, go to someone else about what's being said.
Yes.
And thankfully they did.
Yeah, I mean, you look back at this now, and I mean, it's the sort of tragedy of it is that the hallmarks are so consistent among so many stories like this. There's a clear power dynamic here. There's clear grooming and predatory behavior and escalation. There were open rumors about Mark Foley for years, both within GOP circles, and we'll get to that because I think the way that the GOP covered this up is, or whatever word you want to use, is part of it. But yes, I mean, it just has so many of the standard hallmarks of this kind of story, which we've seen more and more and more of, and we finally started to sort of feel accountable to in the post, I would say, Me Too era.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's also important, since we're situating this in time, to realize that this period in the mid-2000s, the levels of open homophobia within the Republican Party in particular, I mean, in society more broadly, but in the Republican Party in particular, were quite high. Yeah. And so I think that colored the way that this story unfolds, because there had been these rumors circulating that Mark Foley was gay, but he was not coming out because there was no space for that within the Republican Party at the time, and also why people react to it the way that they did. I mean, if this story unfolded now with male or female pages, I think you would have a pretty strong reaction to it in the context of Me Too. But I think that part of the reason you get the sort of as strong of a reaction in 2006 is because these are boys as opposed to girls.
Mm-hmm. But there's always sort of conversations about him being a single man and not being married, and politicians to some extent are expected to be married and to have families and all of this. And he joked that his sister was like his surrogate wife, and sort of like he doesn't have the picturesque family background that people expect to see from a politician, the loving wife on the side, the 2 kids, the dog, whatever it is. And so I do think that in some ways he has to at least compensate for the optics about his bachelorhood.
But also, I would say NIki, what do we call this? This is like the end of the peak family values era for the GOP, I would say. But he's still very much situated, as you were saying, within that, and had, there's, as again, checking off the sort of hallmarks of so many of these scandals or moments. Like, there was a deep level of hypocrisy here because he was a family values person, anti-gay, pro-traditional families representative and champion. And of course, this starts to complicate that.
Yeah, I mean, this is very much the moment when the wheel is turning. So 2004 had been that election where all of those anti-marriage equality propositions were put on the ballot in order to bring out Republican voters. Something that just wouldn't have played out the same way, I don't think, in 2008 or 2012, although it is worth noting that 2008 was Proposition 8 in California. Yeah. So we're not quite through this period, but we're getting toward the tail end of it. Yeah. I think it's also worth talking about the rest of the scandal within the Republican Party, because the cover-up is a big part of the story as well. Mm-hmm. It's ultimately going to lead to the resignation of Dennis Hastert, who was the Speaker of the House at the time, because reports come out that people had been telling Hastert over the course of at least a year, if not longer, that this was going on, and he wasn't doing anything about it. Now, Hastert had, unbeknownst to folks, his own issues. He would end up resigning because of the Foley scandal, but then ultimately he would end up going to prison for covering up his own sexual abuse of minors.
Please don't scoop future episodes for us. We gotta go one mid-2000s scandal at a time there. No, but on the cover-up question, I mean, you know, I think there's two elements here, and again, they start to really help us understand how a lot of these scandals play out and the dynamics of these play out. There's the specific question of, you know, was Hastert and was congressional leadership sent like copies of these emails, and they saw them and they sat on them, or they diminished them, or whatever, or they didn't take action. And then there's also, I think, the larger one of just there were open conversations about Foley being a predator, about Foley, you know, not just rumors in the way we've been discussing, but real sort of concerns. And I think there was probably even a whisper network among people within Congress about stay away from this person, you know, which we've seen again time and time again. And so, I mean, there's two levels of cover-up and accountability there that it's important to keep in mind.
We should also say that, you know, the elections are coming. The elections are always coming. But, like, but, you know, I think the Republican Party is also very much thinking about, will this open up an opportunity for the Democrats to get, you know, a foot in the door? How is this going to affect us? Who will replace him? I mean, the power dynamics that play in terms of who succeeds who and how do we maintain control is very much at the front of all of this. Was it Time did a poll that said 2/3 of those who are aware of the scandal believe that Republicans had tried to cover something up. And I think that's a big reason why.
Yeah, and I hate to spoil other future episodes, but this did fit into an argument that was already building around the Republican Party, particularly in the House, that there had been this culture of corruption that had developed over the course of the 12 years that they had controlled the House of Representatives. And it wasn't just like in the 1990s, Newt Gingrich is brought down by ethics charges, but just a year earlier, you had lost the House Majority Leader, Trent Lott, to a scandal that would end up seeing him put on trial, Duke Cunningham for other sort of corruption issues, Mark Ney. There are all of these people who are under investigation or under ethics charges or getting ready to go to prison. And so this idea of a culture of corruption becomes a big campaign issue going into the 2006 elections.
And in even a larger sense, we've talked a little bit about that on this show about how in 2005, late 2005 into 2006, you know, the worm has really turned for the Bush administration, right? The war in Iraq is going very badly. Katrina, you know, so there's just this larger sense of like GOP is in disarray. And so, you know, like a lot of scandals, the scandals that sort of nudge and push in a direction that things were already going are the ones that seem to have an impact. But this, I think, definitely had an impact, or was another brick in the wall of what ended up being a pretty remarkable fall election, midterm election for Democrats, who ended up winning the chamber for the first time in Congress in 12 years, after 12 years of Republican control.
Can we also say that, like, when Foley steps down or when Foley resigns, you know, he doesn't really say much. I mean, he's just sort of like, I'm deeply sorry. I let down my family. There's no I'm deeply sorry doesn't even address the teenagers that he was, he didn't name anyone or he didn't apologize for specific actions. It was just, I'm sorry, I let down my family, I let down the people of Florida, and that's really it.
And then poof, gone in a cloud of smoke. And for good reason. I mean, first of all, again, he hadn't come out about his sexuality. He wanted to avoid questions about that, but he was also under investigation by the FBI. And I sure hope there was a lawyer whispering in his ear, like, this is not the time to be giving out apologies, because he was facing some pretty serious charges, although the FBI ultimately drops the case a few years later.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth pointing out that it's not like there was ever real accountability here. A couple years later, the FBI basically says we don't have enough to charge him with anything. And he has sort of, in many ways, remained within the political fold in a way that I find kind of stunning.
Yeah, he's based out of Palm Beach County, which is the district that he represented, and it is also where a little place called Mar-a-Lago is. Mm-hmm. And he plays a big role in Florida in 2016, sort of boosting for Donald Trump and his campaign, and has become a sort of fixture in South Florida politics since this resignation.
When you read reports of kind of how he's come back into the fold or how he's still a power player, at least in that part of Florida, I'm struck by some of the reports about the way that he's praised is, here's a man who served in Congress and he stood up for values, but also, and I've read it a couple times, but people have gone out of their way to say, and he's a man who never apologized, right? He was who he was, he had a scandal, but he never apologized, and he moved forward and he stands firm. And I just think that's so telling and so instructive about the sort of Trump ethos of never, deny everything, never apologize. Yes, you may have a scandal, but you don't ever show weakness or show apology. And
but there are receipts. There's receipts.
Of course,
that's what's so absurd. It's not even about this was a hearsay. We don't know if.
Yeah.
There's receipts.
Yeah.
So that to me, the amnesia about how things play out or what someone was actually engaged in, I think is what's so disturbing about that too.
Yeah, but I mean, we're living in an age where receipts don't matter, right? Where a tape of you saying awful things to the host of Access Hollywood doesn't matter, right?
Speaking of spoiling future episodes.
Exactly. Yeah, we are going to say. And also undercutting myself, because I think I will argue in that episode that actually did have an effect and was one of the few things that actually had an effect. But yes, that's right. That is an upcoming episode. All right, let's
Before
leave it
we
there.
spoil more.
Before we spoil too much.
Let's leave it. That is the end of the episode. So, Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
And I believed I owed my constituents, a apology of what happened. I embarrassed them and I embarrassed my family. I have to take that responsibility. In politics, good and bad, you have to accept the fate dealt you. And so I'm not going to put a fine point on who did it and how they did it, because at the end of the day, again, I wrote the instant message.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is the only software your business will ever need. Featuring a suite of integrated business applications, Odoo connects your business operations together so you can get more done in less time. Odoo has apps for everything: CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, marketing, manufacturing, you name it, Odoo's got it. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday.
Radiotopia.